Welcome back. We're going to start again. We left off at the last lecture with the Constitution having been written. We talked about the whole process. We talked about the controversies that developed in the convention and how they were resolved with compromises. I talked about the two main compromises, the two important ones. One was the so-called Great Compromise, and as I think I indicated, the reason they call it the Great Compromise is because without it, there wouldn't have been a constitution. I mean, the delegates just reached an impasse. They were just locked between the Virginia plan, was supported by the large states, and the New Jersey plan supported by the small states, and they couldn't agree, so they finally came up with a compromise. And that saved the convention. I mean, it didn't resolve the underlying problem, and that's what I'm trying to stress, and I hope you got it, that the underlying problem is that we're not clear on whether we're creating a single nation or retaining a federation of states, and we didn't ever answer it. We got around the question, but that's the problem with a compromise. You don't resolve anything. So the issue was still unresolved. But they could go ahead, and that's what was important. They decided, well, we won't wheel about it. We'll come up with a compromise that's sort of half of this and half of that, and it's not clear what it is, but that's what they did. And then, of course, the great 3/5 compromise, which settled the question of how to count slaves in terms of representation, in terms of the population for the House of Representatives. And the point I also made, and I want to emphasize this, they did not deal with the question of slavery. They just did not want to talk about that. And I think I told you the word slavery does not appear anywhere in the Constitution. But it was clear that it was designed to, in some ways, protect slavery. The Southern delegates were there to make sure that that happened. And, especially the delegation from South Carolina, I mean, they were there watching carefully to make sure that nothing came up, that nothing got into that Constitution that'd be construed as in any way undermining slavery. I mean, they just are adamant that they've got to maintain slavery. And so, although the Constitution didn't do it directly, as I said, the word slavery never appears in the Constitution, but it's referred to sort of indirectly. There's some euphemisms that they use. They talked about, persons held to bondage or something like that, And so they would kind of really indicate that's what they're talking about without using the word. And so they got that all done and never addressed the issue of slavery. And I mentioned to you the one guy, Gouverneur Morris, who brought it up and was immediately hushed up by everybody. Don't talk about that. Go away. So, and I think I told you there are people there who don't like slavery, who don't approve of it. There are people there who considered it inhumane. They oppose it on humanitarian grounds. There were people who opposed it as contrary to the American values we're trying to create, that all men are created equal. But they just couldn't deal with it, so they just didn't. They just ignored the whole question. Nobody's willing to confront that question because they can't get over the fact that basically we're a racist nation and we're for white people only, and we can't find a place to deal with African Americans. Even if we don't have them as slaves, we just don't know what to do with them. We don't have an answer, so we just don't deal with it. That's the way to solve a problem, is just ignore it, which is what we were doing. So I talked about those two big compromises. I didn't talk about the smaller compromises that were very, very abundant within the Constitution. Some people have called the Constitution like a basket of compromises, because there were lots of issues that came up besides these big serious questions. There were other minor issues about how we do this, how we do that, how we do this. And there were a lot of differences. There were constant differences of opinion over almost everything that came up. And so there were just dozens of compromises. I mean, they'd work and they'd come up with it, and they'd come up with a compromise. And you know, even though the delegates were discussing some very controversial issues, even though there were a lot of disagreements, the disagreements were always very politely presented. There was no real anger, no animosity ever came out. The delegates kind of stuck to business and worked at finding compromises. The presiding officer of the convention, you might call him the chairman or something like that, was George Washington. And he had occasionally had to remind people, let's follow the rules of order. We've got to stick on target and stuff like that. He occasionally had to remind the delegates to stay on target and keep things going the way they were supposed to. But it was never really serious. It was never got out of control. There was never a time when people were yelling at each other or angry at each other. And they did find compromises. They found ways to settle all of these questions in an amicable way and end up with a document. So you have to give them credit for working things out, for the finding ways to compromise all of the very differences of opinion that people had on a wide range of issues, on almost everything that came into the Constitution. They had to talk about some way, and people had one idea and some people had another idea. And I'm sometimes amused at, or maybe I'm not amused, maybe I'm aggravated at people today who refer to the founding fathers. And I think what a dumb thing to say, because you know the founding fathers wanted this, the founding fathers wanted that. Well, the founding fathers didn't have any one thing that they wanted. They disagreed about everything. So how can you talk about what they wanted when they disagreed so frequently? You know, they had lots of differences, and when they ended, they then decided to have it signed as an approval. At one time or another, there were 55 people who served as delegates to the convention. And maybe on any given day they weren't all there. But there were 55, and of those, 39 signed the document, but 16 did not. So sometimes if I hear somebody referring to the founding fathers, I want to know, well, who are you talking about? Are you talking about the people at the Constitutional Convention? If so, do you mean the 39 who signed the document, or the 16 who did not? And there were people who did not approve of it. There were people who declined to serve. Now, actually, of those 16, many of them had just gone home. Many of them had just left for personal reasons and were no longer participating. They for one reason or another, usually not related to their disapproval of what was happening at the convention, but because they just had personal issues, health issues, or family issues that they had to deal with. So some of the people had just left, but other people just declined to sign it. They did not like the Constitution. They were unhappy with it, and they refused to sign it. Now, there's a couple of big names we want to look at here, because I've told you that Alexander Hamilton was very unhappy that nobody would accept his idea of having a president elected for life. That aggravated him. He also wanted, in his idea, to get rid of states. Early in the convention, he gave a very long speech, about 3 hours long, that everybody agreed was a brilliant, brilliant speech. That his oratory was outstanding, that his knowledge of what we would today call political science was very complete. They probably would have called it philosophy, but they called everything philosophy in those days, so political philosophy. That he knew that stuff. He knew all about the ideas of Locke and Rousseau and Plato and everybody. that he was very, very profound in his knowledge of political science and so forth, and applying it to the situation. And they all agreed that it was just the greatest speech they'd ever heard. And nobody supported his ideas. Any idea that he presented, he got no votes, 0. So I think I told you that at one point he got ticked off because he was not being listened to. Nobody was following his advice. And he was pretty bitter about that because he felt, correctly so, that he was largely the guy who made the whole convention possible. I mean, he'd been working with these other people who were calling themselves Federalists, and it was a group of them that had sort of put this whole package together to have this convention and everything. But he was clearly the leader of that group, and it was clearly his ideas that to have a convention, he was the guy who had salvaged the idea of a convention after the fiasco of Annapolis, when only 5 states showed up. But he was convinced them, look, let's just not give up. Let's not, just because this didn't work, let's not quit. Let's try again. Let's see if we can figure out a way to make this work. He's really the guy who made the convention possible. If you had to pick out one guy, I mean, it was really, there were a number of people involved, and you can't just say it's a one-man deal. But if you had to pick out the most important, you'd have to pick Alexander Hamilton. And he was gone for a while. He left and went back to New York and said nasty things about the other delegates. But he came back and he signed the Constitution. He's one of the 39 because he just felt it was not what he wanted. It was very deficient in his standards. He was very unhappy with it. But he felt it was better than the Articles of Confederation. We had to do something to replace the Articles. We could not continue to operate under the Articles of Confederation. We had to get the Constitution. And the Constitution, with all of its flaws, and he thought there were a lot of them, and he was very unhappy with the document. It was very inadequate as far as he was concerned. It didn't go nearly far enough towards creating the single nation which he felt we needed to be. But he said, you know, he was going to vote up for it as better than nothing. It's better than the alternative, so he'll support it. So he did. He signed it, even though he was not happy with it. Another guy that I might mention is the other person who's really important there, James Madison, who, as I told you, is, if you had to pick out one person who was the author, it would be James Madison. And again, it wasn't just one person, and it was really the people from Virginia. It was the whole Virginia delegation that wrote that first draft, although he was the one who wrote it. But they all kind of pitched in, and they all chipped in their ideas. And then the convention itself made many modifications to that original plan. So it really was not anything exactly like what Madison first proposed, but his draft was always the basis they worked on. They started with that, they changed this, they changed that, they changed this, but they always worked with that Madison draft. So again, although it's the work is of all of the delegates there, they all contributed. But if you had to pick out one, if you had to say as one author, it would be James Madison. And he was not happy with it either. I mean, he was very unhappy with his fellow delegates from Virginia because they voted to accept the Connecticut so-called Great Compromise. He was mad at his fellow delegates, and he felt that they'd caved in when they should have stuck to their guns. He was absolutely convinced that the Virginia plan was right. The way he had written it, it was right to have that all people in the country should have the same weight of a vote for members of Congress. And by kind of watering it down, by adding in the Senate to accommodate the New Jersey plan, you'd watered it down because under that, the vote of somebody in one of the little small states counted a lot more toward electing a senator than the vote of a person in Virginia. And he didn't think that was right. He felt that, that if you're going to have a republic, that every person has to be equal, that they have to have an equal vote, and their vote of the weight of their vote has to be the same. And that was not true under the Connecticut Compromise. So he didn't want to accept it, but he got outvoted on his delegate within the Virginia delegation. As I told you, the states all voted as a state. So the Virginia vote, they cast one vote for the approval, and the Virginia vote went to accept the compromise. And he was angry at his fellow delegates for giving in. And of course you could say, well, I mean, what they said was, if we don't, we won't have a constitution. The idea that somehow, I mean, they'd been arguing for a couple of weeks that that was the thing to do, to have the Virginia plan. And they had not convinced everybody. They couldn't change the minds of the delegates from the small states. So you had to make a compromise. If you didn't make a compromise, no constitution. But still, Madison was not happy with it. He was unhappy that the whole convention had yielded to the small states and accepted this compromise. But like Hamilton, he said, it's better than nothing. He also supported it. He signed it. He was one of the people who said, we got to go with this. If we keep waiting, and if we try to insist on having what I think is right, we probably won't have a constitution. So better to have a constitution, better to have a document that's ready to go than to hold out for what we think or what I think is right. So that's two of the big names. I just want to mention two other big names at this time. Two of the people who've been very important in the Revolution, people who have been real leaders in their states. Two of the people who had served as our representatives to France and had been very instrumental in getting that good deal with France. Two big names were John Adams, who was one of the real leaders in Massachusetts and very important in the Revolution, and Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence from Virginia. So they're two very prominent people, but neither of them was at the convention. And so, I mean, they're important people, but if you try to look at how they felt about the Constitution, where they stood on the ratification and so forth, they weren't there. They did not participate. Adams was our ambassador to Britain at the time, so he was serving his country as our official representative to England. And Jefferson was playing the same role with France. So they're both still very involved in the country. They're still very prominent positions, but they were not at the convention. As I said, sometimes people would go home for a couple of days or so. Hamilton was gone for a couple of weeks. Other people would go home to take care of personal business, so not everybody was there every day. I just want to mention a couple of guys, and I'm not sure of the number. I don't know who they were. I've read, and it's gone on in my head as to who these delegates were. But there were about 4 or 5 guys who were delegates to the convention, but they were also members of Congress. And Congress, you may have lost track of this because we talked about it several classes ago. Congress was meeting at the same time as the Constitutional Convention. So the summer of 1787 was a really important time for the country because in Philadelphia, the convention was writing the Constitution, and at the same time, in New York, Congress was debating and eventually approving the Northwest Ordinance, which was very important and which included that provision that prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory. And there were some of the guys who were involved in both of those. So there's like 4 or 5 guys who would be there in Philadelphia and working on the Constitution, and then they would leave and go up to New York to participate in the debates over the Northwest Ordinance. And so they were involved in both of those, and they kind of went back and forth a couple of times. They were in Philadelphia for a while, and they were going to New York for a couple of days. They come back to Philadelphia for a couple of days at New York, and they bounced back and forth. And we don't really know what all they were doing. We don't know what they always said. We don't know what they did while they were in New York. We don't know what they did while they were in Philadelphia. But we have some ideas about what's going on. We sort of know the days that they were everywhere. I don't think our record is perfect on that. The documents and the accounts of who's there and who's at various meetings is not perfect, and we can't not be sure of it. But we have a pretty good idea of the days that they were in Philadelphia and what they were talking about those days, and the days that they were in New York and what they were talking about in those days. And we know that they were both times they're talking about this issue of slavery. And so we think that these guys were sort of intermediaries between Congress and the convention, and that they're working out a deal on slavery that is part of a large compromise package. That there's more to this 3/5 compromise than just the 3/5 issue. It's part of the picture that we're also going to have the Northwest Territory be off limits to slavery, and we think then, and this is just speculation, but we're just kind of looking at the coincidences of when people are here and when they're in New York and so forth, and it's the same individuals, and that then New York decided this, and we think that there was some sort of, as I said, an assumption that was not written. There's no documents on this. It's not part of the record of the Northwest Congress and the Northwest Territory. We think there was sort of an understanding that that there would be no slavery in the Northwest, and that the Southwest, when it was ready for territorial status, the 3 states that claimed it hadn't relinquished their claims to Congress yet. But when they did, and when Congress got jurisdiction over that, and they started setting up states in the Southwest the same way they set up states in the Northwest, that those states in the Southwest would have slavery. So there's this big compromise that we're going to settle slavery with 3/5 in Congress, and then we're going to divide the West between the territory north of the Ohio River, which would have no slavery, and the territory south of the Ohio River, which would have slavery. And that's sort of the grand settlement of the slavery issue at that time. And I say that it's those, we think that, and it's just sort of circumstantial evidence, but we think that it's those guys who are sort of flip-flopping back and forth between Philadelphia and New York that sort of made that deal possible, that they were the guys who were the emissaries that carried the message and got the deal done. So they got it done. Now, as I said, though, there were several people who did not sign the Constitution. And it's a little bit hard to talk about them because there's, as I said, there's 16 people, and some of them were not really objecting to the Constitution. They just were not around. They had other reasons not to be there, and they were just busy and had sort of dropped out of the convention. But it's a little hard because they each have their own ideas, and some of them were unhappy because the Constitution gave too much power to the federal government, some because it didn't give enough power to the federal government. There's a lot of different reasons between them. They each sort of had their own grievance. And then once it was signed and it was approved, the next step is to go to the states. And what you do is you send a copy of the Constitution to every state, and every state then is going to have a special convention to ratify. They have to have a special election, a one-time only election, to elect delegates to a convention. It's going to meet only, as I say, one time, and it's going to deal only with the issue of ratifying the Constitution. So then it goes to the states. And this was like, I think they wrapped it up sometime in September of 1787. The states started setting these up. They started, the legislature started making the plans to have a special election. They have to call the election. They have to do the hard work of actually arranging for the voting to take place and where they're going to meet and all of the other details. And they're working on that. And some states are done by December of 1787. The first state that finished up was Delaware. They had their meetings, the convention met, and they voted unanimously to ratify the Constitution. The next state down the line, and every state's kind of working on this, but some of them are taking longer than others, and some states, well, Rhode Island wasn't even doing anything. Rhode Island, we know, they didn't send any delegates to the convention, and they're not having a ratifying convention. They're not even having one, so they're not going to ratify the Constitution. That's why the convention decided to have only 9 states have to ratify, because they know Rhode Island isn't, and probably a couple other states. North Carolina also is just not interested in doing this very much, and so states are all different. But we know that Delaware was the first one to ratify. I think Delaware still calls itself to this day. Their sort of state name is the first state, and they call themselves the first state because they were the first to ratify the Constitution. And I think second, I don't remember all of the order, but I think second was Pennsylvania. Delaware had a relatively small number of delegates to its convention. The way they set it up, they only had like 20 delegates. Pennsylvania had over 300. They had a much larger group. And there, though, the support for the Constitution was very strong. They were the second state to ratify, and there it was by a very large vote. It wasn't unanimous, but it was very overwhelming. The support for the Constitution was very strong in Delaware. And I was I'm intrigued that Delaware is one of the smallest states, and Pennsylvania is the second largest state. But they were both they were number 1 and number 2 in terms of ratifying it. And then a couple other states ratified it. I don't remember which states they all are. I can't keep track of all 13 states and when they ratified, but a couple other states ratified very soon, early. Now we're talking about early 1788. It's January, February 1788. A couple other states were unanimous, and then in other states, there's a couple of states there was a good deal of support for it. By say June or so, we had altogether 7 states that had ratified, and each state had done it. But what's happening now is that in these other states, there's more and more opposition to ratification. There's people who we call anti-federalists, the anti-federalists who opposed federalism, opposed the Constitution. And there's still 6 states that haven't ratified, and in those 6 states, the anti-federalists are arguing against it and keeping that state from approving ratification. The reasons for the anti-federalists are very, very complex, very diverse. Some issues are really important in some states. In some states, there's local issues that affect the decision. There's political scheming. There's legislatures that don't want, or there's conventions that don't want to because of some political issue within that state that's unique to that state. Some states were trying to argue about if it would be good for them or bad for that state, for their state. So they all have different reasons. So it's kind of complicated, and it's a very complex thing to look at why the anti-federalists oppose ratification. But to kind of simplify this and to make some generalizations here, I can pick out 2 issues that really sort of summarized why many Americans and many of our founding fathers did not want to have the Constitution. And that's, I sometimes wish I could tell people who say, oh, our founding fathers believe this. Well, hell, you've got to remember a lot of the people didn't even want the Constitution. So are those our founding fathers, the anti-federalists, the anti-constitutionalists? But the two issues are, first of all, there was no Bill of Rights in the Constitution. And many people raised that question and said, why don't we have a Bill of Rights? The Constitution has to have a Bill of Rights, and this one does not. People were familiar with the concept of a Bill of Rights. England had had a Bill of Rights since 1689, at the time of the Glorious Revolution. If you remember back early in the class, I was talking about the Glorious Revolution in England and how they had established rights that we in America felt were our rights as British subjects. And then even England has a Bill of Rights. So why don't we? Every state had a Bill of Rights. They're very different, the exact structure of them. Some of them are separate documents that stand as just as a bill. Some of them are part of their state constitutions. Some of them are part of our laws of the state, and they're passed by the legislature. It's very hard to generalize about these bills of rights, but they all have one. And people are very conscious of this because, after all, the revolution was based on our belief that governments exist to secure these liberties, these rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is what the revolution was about, was to protect our rights. So we got to have rights. We got to have the rights written down. And it's not there. And that then caused many anti-federalists to say, we shouldn't ratify this Constitution. It does not contain a Bill of Rights. So that's one issue. The other issue was the whole idea of a president. Now, Americans are very, very conscious, as I said, of not accepting anything like monarchy. As I told you, of all of the things that Americans disagreed on, and they disagreed on almost everything, but one thing they agreed on was that we did not want monarchy or any kind of hereditary aristocracy in America. That was what we were not going to be. And there was a fear that the idea of a president was a first step toward a return to monarchy. And you know, the Americans are dealing with their own history in this regard. I mean, as colonies, remember, the government had been very much in the hands of the assemblies. There was a governor. Every colony had a governor. But as I mentioned when we were talking about the colonial period, those governors had very limited power. Theoretically, they had a great deal of power, but the reality was that they largely acceded to their assemblies. Government consisted of an elected assembly, representatives of the people, the white males, the people, and the assembly then was elected representatives of the people, and they ran the government. The governor played a very minor role. And that was what Americans knew. That was the system they wanted. And when they feared that England was going to try to change that, then they declared their independence. They wanted to keep that system. Under their state constitutions, every state had some sort of a governor. I mean, every constitution provided for a governor. But consistent with the colonial precedent, those governors didn't have very much power. As I mentioned, the state constitutions gave the governors very limited power. They were what they'd always had, a government that was based on the legislature, elected by the people, and that's what Americans identified as crucial to a republic, crucial to our liberty. That's what we are all about. And so governors don't have very much power. But under the Constitution, the president had a lot of power. And this made many Americans very nervous. They were very unhappy about that. And they said, we should not approve this Constitution because it gives the president too much power. And that's not the way we do things in America. We have, if you have an executive branch, yeah, okay, have an executive branch, and have somebody there who's actually going to administer the laws, who's actually going to run the various departments and see that the state functions. That's good, but not to be a power figure, not to have the power to overrule the legislature, the representatives of the people. So they don't like this idea of a president. And so by, say, June of 1788, the process of ratifying constitutions, which has gone on, started out real quickly, real easily, slowed down a little bit, and by June it's sort of come to a stop. And in the remaining 6 states, there's just a deadlock. There's just an impasse. And ratification is not going anywhere. Well, some of those states, they don't really matter. I mean, nobody cares, and it doesn't make any difference whether Rhode Island approves or not. Rhode Island is one of the ones that's not going to ratify. Okay, who cares? Rhode Island is so small, nobody even notices it. But among the states that were still blocked were two that were really important. One was Virginia, which was our largest state, and the other was New York, which was like our, I don't know, maybe our 4th largest state, but the home of one of the major ports for the country, New York City, and a point that's a really important part of our whole national economy. Port of New York was, as the biggest port in the country, was very important. So yeah, we don't need to have Rhode Island ratify, or another state where there was just no support for the Constitution was North Carolina. That's another small state. But Virginia and New York are crucial. Even if we got 2 other states to ratify, but didn't get New York or Virginia, we really couldn't function. We had to get those 2 states in. What went on in each of those states has a broad significance. Let me take Virginia first, in no particular order. I'm not sure which one did, and I think it's a little bit, they both ended up about the same time getting this resolved. But what happened in Virginia was that the delegates there decided to work out a deal, and the anti-federalists accepted the deal. They accepted an offer from the Federalists. The Federalists, a couple of the Federalist leaders, negotiated with some of the anti-federalists and said, if you'll ratify this, we will then move to amend the Articles. Amend the Constitution. And we'll add a Bill of Rights through the process of amendment. And they made that agreement, and that's what eventually happened. At the convention, had enough people, enough of the anti-federalists change their votes to approve, there were still many people in Virginia who were anti-Constitution. There was some very strong opposition from prominent people in Virginia. I haven't talked about Patrick Henry as one of the, many of you have heard of Patrick Henry, you know, who supposedly said the phrase, "Give me liberty or give me death." Back in the early days of the Revolution, it was one of the really important leaders of the Revolution, leaders of Virginia during the Revolution, but he was strongly opposed to the Constitution. Virginia the legislature had elected him as one of their delegates, and he refused to go. He just turned the offer down, and so then they got Madison or somebody. But he still would not accept it, and there was still a very strong opposition to the Constitution in Virginia. But they got the majority. They got the votes necessary for Virginia to ratify, and so they ratified and became, I guess, number 6, what? There were 7, so it became number 8. And that was done. Eventually the Constitution got started, and one of the first things that Virginia did was to go through the process of starting a process of amending the Constitution. We added 10 amendments to the Constitution. I think they were ratified around 1792, a couple of years later. But that forms our Bill of Rights. Today, the Bill of Rights exists as a result of a deal that was cut between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in Virginia. I think the final vote was something like 77 to 67 or something. So there were still, it wasn't a unanimous vote by any means. There were still many, many of the delegates at the Virginia ratifying convention who did not approve, but the majority did, so that's all that counted. And so Virginia then went on the list of states that had ratified. And so the whole fact that we have a Bill of Rights is an offshoot of the dispute over ratification of the Constitution. Another offshoot of the ratification of the Constitution came out of New York. What happened in New York was that Hamilton, who, remember, is one of the 2 top guys here, one of the people who sort of made the constitutional possible, and was very dissatisfied with it, but he was really committed to getting this thing ratified. He just felt that, we'll worry about the problems later. We've got to get it ratified. We can't keep working under the Articles of Confederation. That's just a disaster. So he decided he had to start doing something about it. So he enlisted to join him. He got together with one of the other delegates from New York, one of the other people who had been on the New York delegation along with Hamilton, one of his friends, a guy named John Jay, who was, like Hamilton, a New York lawyer, and they knew each other professionally. And they had both served on the New York delegation. So he enlisted him in his project. And then he also enlisted in his project James Madison, who was from Virginia, but was, as I said, the 2 main names of sort of the people who got this done were Hamilton and Madison. So Hamilton invited Madison to come up to New York and work on a project. What he wanted to do was to write a series of articles about the Constitution, analyzing it, explaining it, and trying to show why it was absolutely essential to have the Constitution operating for the country. We had to get it ratified. And his hope was that he could get these published. He's actually got an agreement from one of the pro-Federalist newspapers in New York City. One of the editors of the newspaper had agreed to print the articles that Hamilton and his buddies would write, and he would print them, and that would, what Hamilton hoped that would create enough public support for ratification that the convention, which was deadlocked, would then vote to go ahead and ratify, and that he would have public opinion on his side with this sort of public relations campaign of writing these articles. Now, ironically, the convention voted to ratify before any of the articles were printed. They'd been debating this for months. They'd gone back and forth on it, and they finally decided, yeah, we'll ratify. And then the articles started appearing in the New York newspaper. So they actually didn't accomplish their intended purpose. It became irrelevant because New York ratified. Now that's number 9, we're done. But they went ahead and wrote them anyway. Actually, we don't know who wrote all of them. There's about, what is it, I forgot, 80, now I've forgotten the number, 89 different articles. They're called the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers. And as I say, we don't know who wrote all of them. There's some that we know were written by each of the 3. Most of them we know were written by Hamilton. Some we're not sure of. Some of them we can't tell because the records don't say, they didn't keep track of who wrote them, so we don't know for sure. People have tried to sort of judge the style, the writing style, and say, well, this sounds like the way Hamilton would write. I don't know if that's how exact that is. But anyway, but we do know that mainly it was Hamilton's work, especially the last ones. Jay and Madison kind of dropped out of the project once it became obvious that it was really not necessary because the Constitution had been ratified. New York had ratified it. There were 9 states. It was a done deal. So they kind of lost interest in it, but Hamilton persisted and wrote these articles. And you can find them. They're readily available in a book. You can buy a copy of the book, The Federalist Papers. It's very common. It's the standard work on the Constitution. If you ever go to 4-year school, if you continue on and you say major in poli-sci and you take a class on the American Constitution, you know, sort of the textbook is the Federalist Papers. I mean, that's where you start. If you go to law school and you take a course in constitutional law, which you will do in law school, even though very few people become constitutional lawyers, but as part of law school, it's a standard course freshman year, you take constitutional law, and again, sort of the starting point, the textbook is the Federalist Papers. And the Supreme Court has reference to that always if they're trying to figure out what the Constitution was designed to do, what the authors of the Constitution intended for it to do based on their own words, based on the document that they wrote explaining why we should have this Constitution. So the Federalist Papers are an enduring part of America, and they're also an offshoot of the dispute over ratification, and that led to these this very important document, lengthy document, book-length document in American history, the Federalist Papers. Well, we're done. The Constitution was ratified. It's a done deal. The states started the process of selecting. This is now July of 1788. The states started the process of setting up their congressional representative districts. They started having elections in the districts to elect members of the House. They started, their legislatures got together to figure out how they're going to choose their electors. Their legislatures also got together and decided how they're going to choose their senators. Remember, the legislatures chose the senators. So the state legislatures had to have special meetings to elect the 2 senators from their state. By December, Congress is up and ready to go. The states have all chosen their senators. The states had all had elections and electing their House. There were the 2 states that I mentioned to you who are the laggards behind, North Carolina, and the worst, Rhode Island. They still hadn't ratified, so they were still not participating. it would be it was another year or so before North Carolina finally decided to join the Union, and another year after that before Rhode Island finally threw in the towel and said, "Oh hell, we got to join. We can't stay out of this country forever." So, but at least we got the Congress is going, and they're operating as of December of 1788. The process of selecting the president was a little bit more complicated because it's just more complex. You've got to pick out the electors. The states had to figure out how they're going to choose their electors, because the Constitution doesn't say. The Constitution just says that each state shall decide how they're going to have electors. The Constitution says how many electors each state will have based on its population, the number of representatives it has, plus 2 for the number of senators it has, because every state has 2. And so the Constitution says that each state will have this many electors, but it doesn't say how you choose them, and the legislatures had to decide that. This is all in the hands of the legislature. The legislatures had to find some way to choose the electors. The electors had to come together and choose the electors, and then they had to meet and elect the president. Well, this part of the process was a slam dunk. It's not even open to discussion. Everybody knows it's going to be George Washington. And sure enough, Washington was elected unanimously as the president. People just had a great deal of respect for George Washington. Everybody looked up to him. Historians have sort of tried to analyze what it was about Washington that commanded such respect. You know, and it's hard because it's just a personality issue, and it's very hard to define. There was just something about Washington. I mean, people who knew Washington, people who met him, were just impressed with his integrity, with his honesty, with his sense of ability. Some people have pointed out such little superficial things as that he was very tall. He had a very commanding presence. He just kind of looked good. He looked good on a horse. He loved to ride horses, and he looked really good riding horses. He was just a natural horse rider, and that just looked really macho, whatever it was. But everybody respected Washington for his service during the war, and his presidency, his supervision of the Constitutional Convention, and he was just the most respected man in America. So he was just an obvious choice, and he was the one chosen. So it's kind of like, you know, remember, this is one of the big issues of motivating the anti-federalists. One of them has gone away because we've agreed to the Bill of Rights, and that's in process. And then we chose Washington as the president, and it's sort of like, you know, I mean, the anti-federalists would say, oh, I don't think we should have a president. The president may become a monarch. This is a dangerous thing. Why do we have this in the Constitution? We shouldn't have a strong president. And this is the first step toward monarchy. This is a dangerous thing for us to have. And then you say to them, yeah, but it's going to be George Washington. And it's sort of like, oh, well, that's okay then. That's cool. That sort of just takes care of things. And it did. So there's 2 big things that motivated the anti-federalists, 2 big issues, and both of them have gone away. You know, we're going to have a Bill of Rights, and the president's going to be George Washington. So everything's cool. Everything's under control. So we've now got Washington. It took a little while. The Constitution said that the president is to be inaugurated on March 4th of the year following the election. The election was in 1788, so we were supposed to inaugurate Washington on March 4th. We didn't make it. There was just too many details. Too much had to be done, and problems of communication and transportation and trying to get things around. And so Washington wasn't inaugurated until April 25th. I forget the date, but sometime in April. But he was inaugurated, and now we're ready to go. So the Constitution is done. We've got a new government, and in our next class, we'll look at what this new government is going to do. We've got it in place. Now let's see what it does. All right. Your question for the little lecture question is, why did anti-federalists oppose ratification of the Constitution? You'll write a brief statement on that, and we'll pick up in the next lecture.